It was a Saturday morning in early October when I drove out to my son's place to drop off a pair of winter boots I'd picked up for my grandson. The drive takes about 40 minutes from my house through two small towns, past the old grain elevator that's been there since before I was born, and down a gravel road that turns muddy every time it rains. I didn't mind the drive. I never do when it means seeing the boy. My grandson Marcus was 8 years old at the time. Sharp kid. The kind of kid who notices everything and asks questions that make you stop mid-sentence and think. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and from the moment he could talk, he had a habit of saying exactly what was on his mind with no filter and no apology. I loved that about him. My son Daniel had been separated from his wife, Renee, for about 6 months at that point. It wasn't a clean split. There were arguments about money, arguments about the house, and most painfully, arguments about Marcus. They had worked out a temporary arrangement. Marcus stayed with Renee during the week and came to Daniel's on weekends. It wasn't court-ordered yet, just an agreement between two people who couldn't agree on much of anything anymore. I tried to stay out of it. That's not always easy when you're watching your son go through something like that, but I knew getting in the middle would only make things worse. I pulled into the driveway just before 10. Daniel's truck was parked outside, which meant he was home. I grabbed the bag with the boots from the back seat and walked up to the front door. Before I could even knock, it swung open. Marcus was standing there in his pajamas, hair still messy from sleep, holding a half-eaten piece of toast in one hand. He looked up at me and gave me that big smile, the one that goes all the way up to his eyes, and I felt the tightness in my chest ease up the way it always does when I see him. "Grandpa," he said. "Hey, buddy." I held up the bag. "Brought you something." He let me in, and I set the bag down on the couch. Daniel came out from the kitchen with a cup of coffee. And we talked for a while, nothing important, just football and the weather and a neighbor's fence that had blown down in the last storm. Marcus sat on the floor and pulled the boots out of the bag, tried them on over his pajama pants, walked around in circles to test them out. He seemed happy enough. He seemed like himself. But there was something I noticed after a while, a quietness under the surface that wasn't quite right. Marcus was a talker. He always had something to say, some story to tell, some argument to make. That morning he was unusually still. He sat close to me on the couch after the boots went back in the bag, closer than he usually would, and every so often he'd glance toward the door like he was waiting for something. I didn't say anything about it. I figured maybe he was just tired. Kids have off days too. I stayed for about an hour. When I got up to leave, Marcus followed me to the door. Daniel had stepped back into the kitchen to take a phone call, and for a moment it was just the two of us standing in the entryway. I crouched down to give him a hug, and that's when he did something I wasn't expecting. He didn't let go. He held on for a few seconds longer than usual, and then he turned his head so his mouth was right next to my ear. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "I don't feel good in the mornings anymore. At Mom's house." I pulled back just enough to look at his face. "What do you mean you don't feel good?" He glanced toward the kitchen, lowered his voice even more. "She puts something in my milk at night, before bed. She says it helps me sleep, but it makes me feel weird in the morning, like everything is foggy." I went very still. "How long has she been doing that?" I asked. He thought about it. "Since school started." School had started in September. That was 5 or 6 weeks earlier. "Does it happen every night?" I asked. He nodded. I kept my voice calm, though I wasn't feeling calm. Not even slightly. "Okay, buddy. I'm glad you told me. You did the right thing telling me." He looked at me with those serious eyes and said, "I didn't tell Dad because I didn't want to make him upset." That hit me somewhere deep. An 8-year-old carrying that, trying to protect his father from more pain. I put my hand on his shoulder and told him I would take care of it. Then Daniel came back from the kitchen, and Marcus stepped away and went back to his boots like nothing had happened. I said my goodbyes and walked to my truck. I sat in the driveway for a long moment before I started the engine. There are moments in life when you have a choice you can tell yourself you misunderstood, that it was probably nothing, that kids exaggerate, that there's an innocent explanation. And there are moments when something in your gut tells you with absolute certainty that you did not misunderstand, and it was not nothing, and you need to move right now. This was the second kind of moment. I went back inside. Daniel could tell something had shifted the second he saw my face. I asked him to sit down. Marcus had disappeared into his bedroom, which I was grateful for. I told Daniel exactly what Marcus had told me, word for word, as calmly as I could manage. I watched my son's expression move through confusion, then disbelief, then something harder. "She's probably just giving him melatonin," he said. "A lot of parents do that." "Maybe," I said, but he described it as foggy. "Foggy isn't melatonin, Daniel, and he's been afraid to tell you." That last part landed. I could see it on his face. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to take him to the doctor today," I said. "Not tomorrow, today." Daniel looked toward the hallway where Marcus had gone. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he stood up, set his coffee mug down on the table, and said, "I'll get his shoes." We didn't call ahead. We drove straight to an urgent care clinic about 15 minutes away. Daniel sat in the front, Marcus in the back next to me. The boy didn't fully understand what was happening. We told him we just wanted to make sure he was feeling okay, that it was nothing to be scared about. He accepted that the way kids do when they trust you. In the waiting room, Marcus played a game on Daniel's phone. Daniel and I sat next to each other and didn't talk much. There wasn't a lot to say. Either we were going to find something or we weren't, and all the talking in the world wasn't going to change that. When they called Marcus back, Daniel went with him. I stayed in the waiting room. That was one of the harder waits of my life. I'm 63 years old. I've waited in hospitals before. I've gotten bad news in waiting rooms before. But there's something particular about waiting when a child is involved, something that gets into your bones in a way that nothing else quite does. About 40 minutes later, a nurse came out and asked me to come back. The doctor was a woman in her mid-40s, calm and measured in the way that good doctors are. She spoke to Daniel first, then looked at me, and I could tell from the way she composed herself before she spoke that she was choosing her words carefully. Marcus was sitting on the exam table with a paper gown over his shirt, looking between all of us like he was trying to read the room. The doctor said that based on the blood panel and a urine screening, Marcus had elevated levels of diphenhydramine in his system. Diphenhydramine is the active ingredient in Benadryl. In small doses, taken occasionally, it's considered safe. It's an antihistamine that also causes drowsiness, which is why some people use it as a sleep aid. But the levels in Marcus's system were not consistent with occasional use. They were consistent with regular, repeated doses given over a period of weeks. And in children, especially given nightly over an extended period, the effects accumulate: cognitive fog, slowed reaction time, difficulty concentrating, excessive daytime fatigue. The doctor said it carefully and without drama, but the meaning was clear. Someone had been giving Marcus this drug repeatedly, in doses beyond what would be appropriate, without the knowledge or consent of his father. The room was very quiet after she finished. Daniel asked a few questions in a voice I barely recognized. Clinical questions, dosage, timeline, potential long-term effects. The doctor answered each one. She also said, and I will never forget this, that she was required by law to file a report with Child Protective Services. It wasn't a question. It wasn't optional. It was going to happen regardless of what any of us wanted. Marcus, to his credit, sat through all of it with more composure than most adults would have managed. When the doctor stepped out for a moment, he looked at his father and said, "Am I in trouble?" Daniel crossed the room in 2 steps and pulled his son into a hug that lasted a long time. "No," he said. "You are not in trouble. You didn't do anything wrong. You were very brave." I had to look away. On the drive home, Marcus fell asleep in the back seat. He was out within minutes, the kind of deep, sudden sleep that children fall into when the tension they've been holding finally releases. Daniel drove. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the road. "I have to call a lawyer," Daniel said quietly, so he wouldn't wake the boy. "Yes," I said. "And we have to figure out the custody arrangement." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did he know to tell you and not me?" I thought about that. "He didn't want to hurt you," I said. "He was protecting you." Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. The next few weeks were not easy. I won't pretend otherwise. CPS opened an investigation. Daniel's attorney filed an emergency motion for temporary full custody, citing the medical findings in the CPS report. Renee hired her own attorney. There were hearings, depositions, documents. There was a period of about 3 weeks where everything felt like it was suspended in midair, nothing resolved, nothing settled, just the constant weight of waiting. Renee, through her attorney, initially claimed she had given Marcus the medication for legitimate reasons. He'd had trouble sleeping, she said, and she had given him an appropriate dose occasionally. She denied giving it nightly. She denied the quantities the blood tests suggested. The medical records told a different story. Marcus's pediatrician was subpoenaed. She testified that Renee had never mentioned any sleep issues at his last 2 well-child visits. She testified that she had never recommended any sleep aid for Marcus, over-the-counter or otherwise. She testified that the levels found in his system were not consistent with occasional, appropriate dosing. Then something else came out during the investigation, something that hadn't been on anyone's radar until CPS started asking questions. Renee had been in a relationship, had been for several months, overlapping with the end of her marriage to Daniel. The man lived about 30 minutes away. She had been spending several nights a week at his apartment after Marcus went to sleep after she'd given him the medication that would keep him under for the night. A neighbor confirmed it. Her own phone records confirmed it. She hadn't been medicating her son because he couldn't sleep. She had been medicating him so she could leave. When that came out in the hearing, the courtroom was very still. The judge looked over her reading glasses at Renee for a long moment and did not say anything. She didn't need to. The expression was enough. Renee's attorney negotiated a plea agreement with the prosecutor. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of child endangerment and 1 count of unlawful administration of a controlled substance. In exchange for the guilty plea, she was sentenced to 18 months of probation, mandatory parenting classes, and a 2-year supervised visitation arrangement, meaning she could see Marcus, but only in the presence of a court-appointed supervisor, and only twice a month. Was it enough? No. Honestly, no. A lot of people in that courtroom, including me, felt like it wasn't close to enough. My son felt that way. Marcus's pediatrician, who came to the hearing even though she wasn't required to, felt that way. I still feel that way. An adult who systematically drugged a child, her own child, to cover up her own choices deserved more than probation and parenting classes. But the law is what it is, and the prosecutor believed a conviction at trial was uncertain, and so the deal was what it was. What we did get was full custody for Daniel. Sole, legal, and physical custody, with the supervised visitation arrangement I described. Renee could not make any medical, educational, or legal decisions for Marcus without Daniel's approval. She could not take him overnight. She could not see him alone. For now, that was something. In the weeks after the ruling, Marcus went through a period of adjustment that was sometimes hard to watch. He was quieter than usual. He had a few nights where he woke up and didn't want to go back to sleep, not from bad dreams exactly, but from something he couldn't quite name. He saw a child therapist twice a week, a woman named Dr. Patterson, who Daniel described as the kind of person who makes you feel like nothing is unsolvable. The fogginess cleared. That happened faster than any of us expected. Within about 3 weeks of the medication stopping, Marcus's teacher called Daniel to say she'd noticed a significant improvement in his focus and participation. He was finishing his work. He was raising his hand. He was himself again. There's a moment I keep coming back to. About 2 months after everything settled, I drove out to Daniel's house on a Sunday afternoon. It was November by then, cold and clear, the kind of day that makes the sky look impossibly blue. Marcus came running out of the house before I even got out of the truck. He'd been asking Daniel for weeks if he could get a dog a real conversation, not just a passing request. The kind of asking that an 8-year-old commits to fully. Daniel had said yes. The dog was a yellow Labrador, about 12 weeks old, fat and clumsy and thrilled by absolutely everything. Marcus had named him Scout. Scout was currently chasing a fallen leaf across the yard with the single-minded intensity that only puppies and very young children can manage. I stood by my truck and watched Marcus run after that dog, laughing at the top of his lungs, completely unself-conscious, completely free. No fog, no quiet wariness behind his eyes, no weight he was carrying that wasn't his to carry. He stopped at one point, looked back at me and yelled, "Grandpa, watch this," and then did some kind of clumsy cartwheel that Scout immediately tried to participate in by jumping on top of him. I laughed. It came out of me without planning, that specific kind of laugh that only comes when something genuinely fills you up. Daniel came and stood beside me. We watched his son roll around in the leaves with his dog, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then Daniel said, "He told me last night that he was glad he told you, that he knew you'd believe him." I didn't trust my voice right away, so I waited a moment before I answered. "He was right too," I said, "and you were right to act when you did. You pushed me to act. You would have gotten there." He shook his head slightly. "I don't know. I was ready to explain it away. I wanted it to be nothing." That's the honest truth about these situations. We all want it to be nothing. We want the innocent explanation. We want to believe that the people we chose to build families with are not capable of the thing the evidence is suggesting. That instinct is human. I understand it. But sometimes the evidence is the evidence, and the cost of wanting it to be nothing is paid by someone who can't protect themselves. Marcus could tell us something was wrong. He had the words and the courage to say them, at least to me. Not every child does. Not every child gets the chance. I thought about that on the drive home, about how close it had come to going a different way. If Marcus hadn't spoken up, if I had hugged him and said goodbye and driven home without asking, if Daniel had decided it was just melatonin and let it go, any one of those things, And Marcus would still be going to sleep every night with something in his system that wasn't his to bear, waking up every morning with fog in his head, carrying a weight he'd already decided was too heavy to put on his father. All it took was one sentence. An 8-year-old boy with his mouth close to his grandfather's ear, trusting that someone would listen. I'm grateful every day that I did. If there is anything I want someone to take from this, anyone who is watching and has children or grandchildren in their lives, it is this. When a child tells you something doesn't feel right, stop. Stop what you're doing and look at them and listen. Really listen. Not with the part of your brain that is already reaching for the reassuring explanation. With the part that understands a child came to you because they believed you were safe, and the only thing you owe them in that moment is to be exactly that. Believe them first. Ask questions second. That's all. It costs you nothing, and it might be everything. Marcus is 9 now. Scout weighs 42 pounds and still acts like he's 12 weeks old. Marcus made the honor roll in the second semester, and his teacher says he's one of the most engaged kids in the class. He still calls me every Sunday. We talk about football mostly. Sometimes Scout gets on the phone, or at least Marcus holds the phone near Scout's face, and we pretend that counts. It does count. Everything does.